Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All right, boys, we're back with a new In Context. Today is January 26, 2025. Today's topic we decided is going to be three parts. One part is what is U.S. foreign policy regarding the Middle East? How does a Trump presidency affect this policy? And more importantly, hopefully we also get to what were Trump's statements yesterday. He said a lot of wacky things, in my opinion, wacky things regarding Gaza that we definitely got to address. I'll leave the floor to you, sir.
Regarding U.S. foreign policy in general, I think, it's going to go through a pretty big transformation, honestly, to some extent, but to another extent, not so much of a transformation at all. Perhaps the transformation will be more in rhetoric than in actual content, but there will be a rhetorical transformation. We're witnessing it right now. For the last few months, Joe Biden has basically been, missing in action, so to speak. And Trump has put his voice out pretty loud and clear in his first week in office. I do think the United States wants to pivot out of the Middle East still. I do believe that. I think that's been a goal for a while now because I really think that most people who get it, quote unquote, get it, see that China is really the real challenge. And this thing with China and this new AI, by the way, that they just they just released this free version of AI that's much better than anything that the Americans have created. Like this is going to scare a lot of people. And this is going to scare a lot of people high level in the State Department that China is able to they're winning this AI race right now, it looks like. And so the United States doesn't have time to deal with, the usual stuff that it's been dealing with in the Middle East. It wants to turn to China because it's only a matter of time for China fully annexes Taiwan, brings it back under its orbit completely, which would be a major loss for U.S. intelligence gathering reasons and whatnot in East Asia. So, it's interesting the cast of characters Trump is putting together. Some of these guys are hardcore evangelical Christian Zionists that have a biblical understanding of the end of the world, and they're not going to be flexible at all with anything related to Gaza because they want to see death and destruction because that'll bring back Jesus, in their opinion. On the other hand, you have a couple people recently, this Dominio guy, who I think he has connections at Quincy Institute, actually, and he seems to be somebody who has a very sort of sensible understanding of foreign policy. I listened to him give a couple minutes discussion about his understanding of Iran, for example, and it was pretty interesting. It was very different from the hawkish tone you hear from, Brian Hook or these other Pompeo, right? He was making the point that, Iran isn't really a threat to the United States. Maybe to Israel it is, but if we're talking America first, Iran is like the least, Mexico is a bigger threat with the immigration crisis than Iran. And, the idea is that, like, yeah, you don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but there's still room for negotiation to negotiate a Trump version of the Iran nuclear deal that Obama negotiated, and we move on and we deal with other problems. And it's put a lot of Washington's war hawk Zionist lobby in concern because this Nufti and UANI and these other anti-Iranian government lobby group that they just want to see the United States bomb Iran as soon as they can, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen, at least immediately. And I think that's really scaring a lot of these guys. So there's a lot of confusion right now, I think, at all levels. I think, Zionists are probably not overly happy with the sort of rhetoric that seems to indicate that maybe an Iran missile strike on the nuclear sites is not on the table. So I think U.S. foreign policy right now is going to go through some flux. But I still think, even if the United States, quote unquote, pulls out of the region, they'll still be there. We all know that. It just will probably be a different manifestation of how they're there. But I do expect the public face of foreign policy, once we get past all this Greenland and Canada annexation nonsense, to really shift towards East Asia, to really shift towards China, because I think that's where, at least in the eyes of American elites, and perhaps rightfully so, that is a real threat to the American hegemony right now. It's like, because whoever wins the tech and AI war is going to probably be the new hegemon in due time. And China, might be winning that. So that's my sort of initial take on U.S. foreign policy as it stands.
The U.S. government has strategy to its foreign policy, and I think this strategy is to maintain U.S. hegemony over the international order, not over the Western Hemisphere, but over the whole international order, in a state in which nobody would even dare challenge the U.S. hegemony of the international order. That's the strategic goal. Now, there are strategies to achieve this goal, and I don't think change of government from Trump to Biden to Trump changes anything about that. You know, people look at Trump and his bragging and his pretense to unpredictability and his self-involvement and narcissism and assume that, well, then that means that he is going to throw the baby and the bathtub. But that is not true, because even in his narcissism, his interests are closely allied to those of an imperial, colonial, hegemonic US. So even if you take him on his word that he is self-absorbed narcissist, which is true, that doesn't mean that he is going to undermine the strategic goal or the strategy of the US to maintain hegemony over the whole world. What it means is he is going to use different tactics. So there will be a tactical break with the policy that the US followed under Biden to achieve these strategic goals. A change in a tactical break, as opposed to a natural evolution that naturally happens as administrations transfer in the US, means that we're going to see new things happen, just like we saw when Obama transferred to Trump. We're going to see it now. And what we're seeing is a huckster trying to fashion an international foreign policy. This works well if you are trying to sell real estate in New York, but typically it doesn't work well in foreign policy. So Biden spent the first 2 years of his administration just trying to regain US international credibility. When you are trying to act as the organizing power of international order, it is not a good idea to be unpredictable, because it means that everybody else in the international order, whether your allies or enemies, can calculate. Your enemies may be at disadvantage when they can't calculate, but your allies are at a lot of a disadvantage. And that harms you. And Biden spent the first 2 years just trying to patch up the Western alliance. The war in Ukraine helped him do that, and he has managed to cement it. And he was just bragging about the fact that the NATO now is more relevant than it has ever been since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now comes Trump. So I think his tactical break is going to be harmful. I agree with Joseph that the fundamental strategic challenge that the US perceives is China. This is not new. Actually, you can trace it all the way back to Bush Jr. when he took over. I'll remind everybody with the friction he started his administration with in China when they brought down his plane. The US was actually picking a fight with China back then. Now, it was distracted by 9/11 and by a new colonial campaign in the Muslim world. And then it came back to look at China again. And then it was just distracted with Ukraine. Then Gaza. It's 25 years after the fact. And that's a testament that international policy is not mechanical. It's not a machine. Even the hegemon can't run it like a clock. Joseph, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of agree with pretty much what you're saying. The key here is to understand that, Trump's personality and Trump's actual results and outcome aren't always the same. He's already backing off on his, for example, the World Health Organization, where he's pulled out. Now he's sort of leaving a carrot out there that maybe he'll come back in if, right? And then sort of you see the same thing with the tariffs on China that he's delayed. And, I think that the rhetoric is meant to grab people's attention, but in the end, I just don't think that there is a genuinely coherent overall approach. And I think that'll ultimately backfire. Not that Biden had much of a coherent approach either, but people seem to be giving Trump a lot more credit than he deserves. I think the overarching theme with Trump's entire foreign policy is he doesn't want to be perceived as somebody who's starting wars and sending Americans to fight. That's
Or somebody who's weak.
He doesn't want to be seen as somebody who's weak, but I think he knows the one thing that really got him into power was his sort of strength peace through strength,
Mhm.
right? But if you don't have peace, then if you're at war, you're no longer upholding your what your promise was to many growing America First anti-war people, which is really interesting to see that these people who at one point would have probably been neocons are now sort of gravitating towards the anti-war position, even more so than the left, which still seems to, in some, not the radical left, but like the Democrats, right? But
Mm.
that seem to be the party of war at this point. I mean, especially after Biden just allowed Gaza to be obliterated for the last year and a half.
Mhm.
So, like, I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, especially with these anti-Iran war people that are Dominio and Eldridge Colby and some of these other guys that are floating around at the top of Trump's foreign policy circles, especially regarding the Middle East. And I think it's interesting to see him basically ban Brian Hook from like any participation in the White House and to pull the security detail from Pompeo and Bolton. And to me, that's very shocking. And it really shows that Trump is really a man of no loyalty because there's not a single person on this planet, including his own wife, who's more loyal to Donald Trump than Mike Pompeo was. I mean, Mike Pompeo bent over and kissed the feet of Trump at any moment necessary. I can't think of one incident where he actually even remotely challenged Trump. And he's now basically been completely kicked off the club. And it's just, to me, I understand Bolton, they never got along, but the
Mhm.
Pompeo thing to me is really something. And it just goes to show that there's probably gonna be a lot of turnover within this administration, just like last time. And it's gonna be a very choppy 4 years. That's how I see it. So it's very hard to lay out this is what the vision of foreign policy is gonna look like. Because in 2 weeks we could be having a very different conversation potentially.
One thing you point out that is interesting, you have the uh, uh, an actual Zionist wing of Trump of the Trump gang or the Trump cohort, and there is a realist wing. And I think this is a conscious process on Trump's behalf. As a policy, he plays both sides of the house, so that everyone is at his fingertips, and everyone serves his interests. So if he wants to go right, he uses those guys. If he wants to go left, he uses the other guys, and he balances them against each other. That's
I mean,
that's how he
what's
runs
interesting.
the policy.
What's interesting about that is that's exactly what Stalin did during World War II, when he ran the two generals against each other to conquer Berlin. This is a time-tested strategy of authoritarian leaders, is to have to push different factions against each other, and then to play the role of peacemaker. Right? This is like exactly this. Read about how, for those of you out there, read about Stalin and how he played his generals off each other throughout World War II in order to basically get them to compete with each other for his affection. And then Stalin would be the one who was like, okay, let's make peace. And then he would come out as the good guy. This is exactly Trump's strategy. And this is something you see in a lot of authoritarian regimes. It's interesting. I highly doubt Trump has sat around and read books about how to be a good dictator, but he certainly has a natural tendency to understand these behaviors, these coup-proofing behaviors, and even the way he puts his own family members in certain high-level positions. The ambassador to Lebanon, right, is a member of one of the Lebanese guy who's married to one of his
His
uh
his daughter's father-in-law.
yeah yeah. I mean, this is like classic strongman strategy, is it not? So
Yeah.
this was done during Islamic time, during Islamic Caliphate times too, right? This is very common to
No,
sort of
this
use
is
your family connections to coalesce the empire, and it's completely against the American understanding of what democracy and separation of power is supposed to be. It's a very pre-modern understanding of politics, but it
or
is
the
what we got.
or the firing of the inspector generals on Friday night.
Hmm. Mm.
This yes. So it seems to me that Trump is doing serious damage to U.S. international standing. On the domestic level, I don't think that is really a serious issue because at the end of the day, in domestic policy, people look to prices and delivered services. and whether the
Unless there's a war, then things change.
yes, but
That's why Trump wants to stay out of war
but
because he's
but that's an international side of things.
yeah,
Domestic,
that filters into that's the one international thing that really filters into the domestic.
yes,
That
but
upsets people.
on the domestic side, it has to do with delivery of services, and
Yeah.
so as long as services are delivered, regardless of how much corruption hide behind the back, well, actually, it has always been around. But internationally, that harms the international standing of a power that is trying to continue to be the hegemon of the international order. So I think Trump is good for humanity because he is degrading the hegemonic control of the US over the world, which is dark comedy.
It's it's interesting because that's what actually I hate to say this, but I sort of see it similarly. In many ways, it opens the door to you want to call them Islamic political actors to have more legitimacy. Like you can't bash people over the head anymore with liberalism if the United States themselves aren't rejecting it. If the entire liberal international order is being pulled by the people who started it, I think it does create more space for alternative modes of political organization. I think it bodes well for the new Syrian government, to be honest. I mean, who is the United? I mean, this Trump administration isn't going to go there and demand LGBT rights. They're not going to go there and demand, DEI and other things. You know what I mean? Like, and the Germans are going to probably try to play that role, but nobody takes them seriously. And I think that it's really interesting because the collapse of this veneer of liberal internationalism does, in my opinion, open the door to alternative, potentially Islamic modes of political discourse. And as a Muslim, I think that we have to see that as a positive thing.
In it's a positive net, but it's not a positive circumstance. So actually, to my mind, over the last few years, we have regressed from the place Bush Jr. took us to, which is a recreation of the world after World War One and the commencement of an international, explicitly colonial order, to the pre-World War One of the end of 19th century, where we had a colonial struggle over the Middle East. So in the last few years between Biden and Trump, I think the Middle East and the Muslim world is seeing a recreation of history will not repeat itself, but it's a similar fashion of recreation of colonial struggle, open colonial struggle over the open for colonization regions. And that's what we're seeing today in Africa and in the Middle East. That is a regression to end of 19th century. So it's a scary place. On the other hand, it might be the only way out.
Well, since we're talking about Trump, we need to address some of the things he said, I think just yesterday regarding Gaza. In particular, potentially sending the refugees the inhabitants of Gaza to Jordan and to Egypt. So
to state explicitly what he said that I'm going to state it as linear facts rather than his haphazard way of saying things. He stated that Gaza is completely demolished. There is a need to move at least most of its population, about 1.5 million, to either Jordan or Egypt on a temporary or probably permanent, which he called long-term basis, and to establish housing there so they can have quote-unquote good life. That good life term has been repeated by Smotrich, is we're going to help them leave Gaza to have good life elsewhere, which seems to continue the statements that Trump started. So this is the statements of facts. The event was Trump was on his plane going back from an event in Las Vegas to Washington. He held a so-called press gaggle, meaning he stood literally at the door of his compartment in the plane with a few reporters around him recording his words. I think this is deliberate. I think it's deliberately meant to be a teaser rather than a full press conference where he could be interrogated at length and has to give a clear policy statement. Since then, there has been a leak from his government. Oh, actually, we didn't mean a long-term ejection from Gaza. We meant 6 months to a year. I think this is the start of a walk back. And the Jordanian government saying there is no such thing ever going to happen. That's official as of this afternoon. And Mahmoud Abbas was raised out of the dead to say, and we're never going to allow that. Everybody else also said the same thing. Actually, the resistance in Gaza came out saying, well, what the Israelis couldn't achieve in 15 months, he's not going to achieve through political means. I think we have to take, like the European politicians said, we have to take Trump seriously, but we should not take him literally. Meaning, this is a huckster who is trying to soften his audience or his interlocutors into accepting the scam he's going to implement on them. And I think he's trying to soften the Arab colonial regimes to accept the demands he's going to make on them to finance his administered occupation of Gaza. And he is doing that by threatening them to export the Israeli problem, which is the population of Gaza, into them. The Arab states, not just Jordan and Egypt, will be scared to death of this. And I mean specifically also the Gulf states. Because if that were to happen, Jordan could actually collapse. And that would scare the daylights out of the Arab Satan and all his friends. The US is on the record previously warning Egypt that if it were to happen, it will disturb the stability of the Egyptian state. So I don't think the Egyptian state is about to accept this. And I don't think that Trump is serious because of the way he actually made the statement. I think it's just a threat to soften the population.
You know, you make a good point. The timing, the location of what he said. I mean, it could have even potentially been just him talking off the cuff, like without even really thinking about it. Maybe we're even overthinking this. It was just a guy saying something that, oh, it'd be nice to have peace. And I don't even know if it was a coherent strategy, but that's one possibility. Like, it could have just been literally saying something that, you know, it'd be nice, wouldn't it, if we could find peace? And but the other possibility is that, yeah, he might have said this with the intent of getting attention. But I think even he knows that none of these regimes are going to just roll over and take that. So it could be an effort to sort of soften things up and to start setting the groundwork for negotiating some kind of agreement on certain issues related to this. Though the idea of 1.5 or 2 million people from Gaza being, you know, ethnically cleansed into 2 different countries is clearly not even feasible and realistic. Anyone with a brain knows if that happened, the war would be launched now from Jordan and Egypt at Israel, because the people from Gaza aren't going to just go to Egypt and start working in the factories and, you know, get a job as a taxi driver and move on.
There are no factories.
I know. My point is it's just the war is just
Even
gonna
if you want it, it
international.
doesn't exist.
But here's the thing: is like even Trump's advisors have to be clever enough to say, "Hey, look, if you do expel these people, now the war becomes a world war, because no longer is it a war in Gaza; it's now Egypt and Jordan and Israel all involved in a massive Middle East war." So, like, I don't even think that maybe the most extreme elements in the far right coalition in Israel think this is a good idea, but I don't think anybody really truly believes that that's going to work. Realistically speaking, I think the idea probably would be to have some strong man from the UAE or one of the other Gulf countries oversee the reconstruction of Gaza and sort of act as a sort of Arab regional overlord or whatever you want to call it. This is what I heard was one of the things they wanted to do earlier.
That was the Biden-Harris plan.
Was that what happened?
Biden-Harris plan. Literally, Harris discussed this with Mohammed Zayed the last time she was in UAE. Literally.
Yeah, this could carry over in a Trumpian form in the new era we now live in, potentially, in my opinion. That's a possibility, but that's not going to happen either. I mean, I really don't know what's going to happen over there, to be perfectly honest. It's such a tragic situation. But I do think that here's one thing I do believe, and this was a point made by couple people, I think Shadi Hamid made this point even online. It does seem like Trump at least is more human in the sense that he understands that the people in Gaza are not happy. Whereas Biden literally seemed like he didn't care whatsoever. It didn't even register with him. Like, I don't know if it's a messianic belief in Israel or he's just senile or he just hates Arabs. But Trump seems to understand, oof, this sucks. I wouldn't want to be them. Like, he can put himself in the shoes and say, I wouldn't want that. Whereas I don't think Biden even is, it's like, it's not calculating his head. So with that being said, being the human beings have a natural, who are normal human beings, have a natural sort of, I think, inclination to try to mitigate suffering that could potentially be, at least it's a better starting point than Biden, who I think, quite honestly, couldn't care less how many Gazans were killed. That's my opinion. I don't think he cared.
I think you should be able to understand the Biden administration point of view, given your academic background. These guys believe their own guff. So they believe that because we look legal under the international legal convention, then everything's fine and nobody sees that we are responsible for the genocide. And we're fine because legalistically, we are not responsible. And we have declared legalistically that we have nothing to do with it and that we told Netanyahu not to do it. So they think that nobody sees them because they are legalistically are speaking the right language. So they believe their own guff. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. That's absolutely.
One last point I want to make. That's the point I want to come to. The fact that Trump is willing to use this language is quite obscene. Actually, both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich came out on X and supported Trump's proposal. I believe he is using it as a tactic. However, his language even is really obscene. Clean out Gaza, as if these were some sort of infection. We are indeed regressing to pre-20th century colonial status. Yes, that shows that the empire is not invincible as people think, because actually back then the empire was weaker than it was after World War One. But it also says that we are into a lot of viciousness and ugliness. And we're going to see more of this. Okay. جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم.
Assalamu alaikum.